Painting freehand designs can be a brilliant way to add life and story to your Warhammer miniatures. It also displays a level of skill which few artists will attempt, immediately making your models stand out to the person viewing them. But it is not an easy technique to master. In this episode of Hobby Corner, we're going to work through how you can add this process to your painting skill set. Have you ever stared longingly at a beautiful Space Marine banner packed with freehand detail and wondered how could you achieve such an effect on your models? I know I certainly have, and over the last few years I've been refining my process for adding freehand designs to my world eaters and other miniatures. I'm certainly no expert on the technique, but I have devised some methods which have made the process easier to carry out. Before we dive into executing these methods, I do want to caveat this video by saying that freehand painting is a complicated and often frustrating process. It takes a lot of practice and patience to create impactful pieces of work. You have to be willing to put that time into the method if you want to be rewarded, so keep that in mind as we work through this video. Unlike most miniature painting techniques, freehand painting benefits greatly from the artist having a certain amount of skill in art outside of the hobby. People who are skilled in sketching or canvas painting will find this much easier to do than those who are not. But that doesn't mean you can't learn this technique if you don't have these skills. In fact, by training yourself in freehand painting on miniatures, you can actually become decent at sketching and canvas painting. If this is your first time attempting any sort of freehand, don't worry if it doesn't look amazing. As with all miniature painting techniques, practice and refinement is the key to success, so keep working at it and keep pushing yourself. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to categorize freehand techniques into two separate groups: basic freehand and complex freehand. Basic freehand includes things like script and lettering on power armor, chaotic runes, and simple line work and shapes. It's actually pretty easy to master this technique, requiring just a little bit of planning before jumping in with some paint. We're going to cover this basic freehand in today's first half of the tutorial. Complex freehand is an entirely different beast. It involves creating a design on a larger surface of a miniature which incorporates intricate shapes, shading, lighting, and tonal qualities. This is probably where most people abandon their freehand journey, as it can be very frustrating to put quite a lot of time into a piece only to be dissatisfied with the result. Personally, I'm still working on complex freehand and I'm nowhere close to mastering it, but I do have some good tips for how to begin learning this technique and work on improving it. We're going to cover that in the second half of the tutorial today. So let's grab our brushes and paints and jump into the methods, kicking things off with basic freehand. As I alluded to already, basic freehand generally encompasses applying fairly simplistic designs, such as lettering and numbering, to a miniature. I do this quite a lot for my world eaters, often covering their power armor in chaotic runes and motifs, and it's generally the first step most people will take on their quest into freehand. You can add so much character to a simple miniature by applying some subtle, basic freehand, and it's a good way of improving your brush control and precision. So how do we do it? For this part of the tutorial, we're going to use a nice flat canvas to demonstrate the technique. I've chosen a rhino door, a spare bit which I seem to have a lot of, and it makes for a good practice board when I'm trying new things. I quickly painted this up in my standard World Eaters white recipe, but I haven't weathered any of it just yet. Freehand is always applied before weathering. After all, the cultists paint those foul emblems on before the tank rolls out into battle. Regardless of if you are doing basic or complex freehand on a miniature, it is absolutely essential to take some time to plan your designs before cracking out the paintbrush. All freehand requires an understanding and respect of the space or area you're working with. These are miniatures, you don't have a lot of real estate for your designs, and you need to keep this in mind when you're thinking about what you want to do. A detailed Chaos Star is much easier to pull off on a tank door than it is on a Space Marine pauldron, for example. I keep this in mind during the planning step, using a page from my paint book to quickly sketch out the idea. I also generally use a lot of references at this stage. Warhammer is a universe with so much existing iconography which can help inspire your own ideas, so spend a little time browsing Instagram or Pinterest to see what pulls your interest. One of my go-tos is the Realm of Chaos books, which contain so many impactful works of art, and a full alphabet of chaos runes and symbols. I'm going to draw this on as a source of inspiration for the design I want to use on the rhino door. Most of the time I do a preliminary sketch, which is a scaled up drawing of the final idea to give me a general feel for the design and how easy it will be to execute. I'm going to keep things fairly simple for this piece, so let's do a classic Chaos Star with some extra runic additions. Once I'm happy with that initial design, I normally recreate it on a smaller scale to ensure that it won't look overcrowded on the actual miniature. If I'm happy with how this looks, it's time to move on to painting the plastic, and this is where the fun begins. My planning sketches will serve as a reference point during the painting, so I'm going to keep these close in front of me as something I can look back on if I'm struggling. Understanding the space you have to work with is vital when it comes to painting the plastic, so I'm going to begin by marking out the center point and extremities of the design. This way, I know that this is the area I have to work within. It means my design won't accidentally float off the model at any point, and it helps keep the piece to look more cohesive and sensible. Once I have those main points put down, I'm going to start marking in the lines of the Chaos Star, which will also function as helpful guidelines for creating the main circle. Checking back with my reference, I'm going to start marking in the shape of that circle now. Circles are difficult for humans to draw, so I'll overcome this evolutionary obstacle by rotating the model while dotting in the shape. Once those dots are down, I start lining in the circles. And now is a good time to step back from the piece and give it a quick check over to ensure that it's looking okay. You'll notice me doing this a lot during the tutorial. If you see an issue, take a moment to correct it, since it's much easier to resolve it immediately than when there's more paint put down. You'll find that freehand is actually all about revisiting and altering parts of a design, and I think this can be one of the aspects which frustrates people quite a lot in the beginning. It's totally fine not to get it right the first time, and editing mistakes is a quintessential facet of the technique, so don't give up if your shapes don't seem correct on the first pass. When I have those arrowheads done, I move on to lettering. Lettering and numbering are one of the best places to start practicing freehand, and they're great for gaining an understanding of basic technique and use of space. This step usually takes me a little longer and requires slightly more precision to make it look good, so I spend most of the time here using the outer circle as a guideline for the positioning of the letters. When I'm happy with those, I move on to the finer script, easily done by lightly tracing the brush in linear patterns with slight jagged motions to create the illusion of fine writing. By varying the pressure on the brush, we can create spaces and indents, and a larger first letter can be a great way to add interest to these pieces. As an additional weathering step, I decided to add run marks where the paint, or possibly blood, has dripped down while drying. This can be a great way of adding life and story to the piece, suggesting a lack of neatness and precision from the artist, which works really well for the followers of Chaos. It's really easy to do. Start with a slightly thicker line where the paint is running from the main design, and carefully trace the brush downwards until it tapers off. It's a good idea to vary up the length of the lines too, to avoid uniformity. Lastly, I'm going back in over the entire design with the main color, reinforcing the image with another pass all around. It will help make it jump out from the background and also strengthen any areas that may be faded or slightly translucent. This might seem tedious, but it is a vital step to ensuring the design looks good. I also use this time to pull slight lines off the main design, again suggesting a lack of care or precision when the cultists were painting this on. You wouldn't do this if you were painting Loyalist Marines or Eldar, for example, but instead use this time to tidy up and refine any line work which has gone awry. Chaos is much more forgiving, and you can really have fun here, adding subtle life to the whole thing. Once that main design is reinforced, I'll also do a pass across the lettering, which requires a delicate touch to avoid any of the details blobbing up and becoming unclear. Once that's all done, the piece is finished for now. I'd add weathering and washes next, to tie everything together and bring the design into the actual model, which you can see here on this panel from my brass scorpion that I'm working on, which has a much more complex design, but still follows all the principles we just covered. Start with something simple to get used to the technique, and then move on to more ambitious projects like this. Okay, let's move on to part 2 of the tutorial, Complex Freehand. As the name suggests, this technique is harder to do and requires much more patience. It involves adding shading, tones, lighting and layers to a freehand piece, and is used when you want to create a more detailed piece, such as the banners I've got here. The technique is not beginner friendly, and I suggest spending some time to master those basics before moving on to this. But once you're feeling ready, you definitely should give it a go. It can massively level up your painting skills and looks really impactful when it goes right. For this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how to paint the freehand on this banner, which is the flag carried by my honor guard for their Master of Executions. Just like the basic freehand, we start with a preliminary sketch. These tend to be more detailed and require a few different concepts usually, but they will serve as a reference point while we're painting. As a rule of thumb, if I can't draw it, that probably means I can't paint it. So if the prelim sketch is too hard, I usually make it more simplistic. As a canvas, we're using this resin banner, which I've quickly shaded in with some dark red tones. As before, we begin by dotting in the border, starting with that chaos star. I'll draw in basic construction lines to help guide where the main design will be, and then spend some time working out the border of the skull. The skull is really the central focus here, so it's important to get it right. The initial lines mark out the length and breadth of the skull, which can be hard to do correctly the first time, so don't be afraid to go back and redo it if it doesn't look quite right. Then I'll do some dot work to mark out the silhouette of the skull, being very careful to keep an eye on my reference and ensure I'm following the same pattern. I'll also mark out the raised areas within the design, such as the cheekbone, jawline and mouth area. It's a good time to stop here and consider the piece. If it's feeling right, I'll keep on going, but otherwise I'll go back and try to figure out what's gone wrong and what needs to be redone. Again, this is a totally normal part of freehand work, so don't be disappointed or frustrated if you don't hit it immediately. When I'm happy with that basic shape, I go in with a mid-tone, Xandri dust in this case, and fill out the body of the skull. This will serve as a base layer that I can build up on. Even though I'm overriding some of the details, it's no problem. We already worked out where they should be, so we can bring them back in at a later step. Next up is putting in important aspects such as the eye socket, nose socket and mouth. This is done in black and will be key guiding points for the rest of the piece. Positioning these correctly is tricky, and you'll see me refining the placement and size quite a bit here. If you go wrong, it's really easy to overwrite them with that base color and start again. So constantly referencing the prelim sketch, make sure that you're well guided and keeping to what you know looks good. So make sure you're checking back on it regularly. Now we'll start adding some tones. I begin with a nice mid-tone which serves as a good baseline, and from there I start penciling in shadows. Placing the shadows correctly with light dots of the brush is vital, but can easily be corrected if a mistake is made. I usually do the dark areas first, as it tells me a lot about the piece, and they're pretty easy to do for a skull, pooling in all those natural crevices. Using a dark brown, I do some fine line shadows as well to denote the cheekbones here, and you can really see the skull gain a lot of definition and shape once these are put in. I also use a very fine line of black to denote the deepest recesses, which can be quite striking. Once these are put in, I begin to work outwards, gradually lightening browns using fine dots from the brush to create the shadowy transition until it gets somewhere that I'm happy with. Following this, it's highlight time. First, I come back in with Xandri dust, using it as a highlight tone for the raised areas like the cranium, cheekbones, around the eye socket and jawline. I also use it to highlight the border of the skull to make sure that that's not lost in the banner. Then I do another highlight with a shabti bone, this one more refined and delicate than the previous. Highlights on freehand need to be placed very carefully and sensibly, otherwise you risk washing out all the hard work you've already done. Lastly, I return with black to make sure those eye sockets are still making sense, making final edits and tweaks until I've reached a point I'm happy with. Now we have the flame designs. Flames are actually one of the easiest freehand bits to paint, and a good point to start if you're just getting into complex freehand. They are pretty free flowing, and highlighting them is easy, since you just have to gradually build up brighter reds, oranges and yellows until you reach the epicenter of the glow. They're a lot more forgiving of mistakes too, so I recommend trying them out if you want to dive into more complex freehand, mainly as a way of understanding how to build up color and work towards a light source. Here, an initial pass to sketch in a rough template for the fires, followed by progressively working in brighter reds, each time moving closer to the center. I use the brighter reds and oranges to mark out tongues of fire and the center of the blaze, sometimes leaving a darker area for shadow within the fire, while occasionally pulling a highlight higher up too. Quick, free motions with the brush are key here to ensuring the fire looks organic and living, rather than a value sketch. As we start to introduce really bright oranges and yellows into the design, we want to be quite sparing with their placement, using them primarily as highlight colors around the center of the piece. You can work through this as much as you want, but normally I like to work the flames right up to a white hot yellow to finish it off, which really makes the design pop out. The rest of the design actually follows a similar line work technique to that which we covered in the first half of the tutorial. Using the dot tech to sketch out the boundaries, I line in the Chaos Star with a base tone, ensuring that everything is making sense and flowing with the direction of the fabric. We're following all the same patterns as before, taking our time not to rush this last part, especially since we put so much effort into the initial complex images. If you get sloppy here, it can ruin the whole thing, so just be patient and enjoy the process. The hard bit is over. Once the initial pass is down, I came back in with a brighter tone so that star jumps out, but still works alongside the skull symbol, reinforcing the entire design and strengthening the line work. It's pretty much identical to what we did for that rhino door. I also sketched on a bunch of symbols, script and the like in the further corners of the banner to bring some life into those darker sections and make sure the whole piece didn't seem too small given the size of the canvas. Again, drawing on the realm of chaos for inspiration. With that, we are pretty much all done. I tidied up the piece and added a few small details off camera, but that about covers my method for painting freehand, be it complex or basic imagery. As I mentioned, freehand can be a daunting skill to try and get into, and it certainly takes some effort to master, but I think you'll probably agree that it's definitely worth it. The feeling of pulling off a freehand piece is great, a true accomplishment worthy of praise, and often it's my banners which draw the most attention when I display my armies. That said, I am nowhere near mastery of the technique. Even recording this tutorial has been a learning experience for me, and it's just another step on my artistic journey. Just remember, if you want to get into freehand, it will take time and patience to get the hang of. It's entirely unlike other mini painting techniques, and the payoff isn't immediate. You'll probably get many things wrong before you find your flow, and that's totally normal. The only wrong way to approach freehand is by trying it once, deciding you can't do it, and never attempting it again. This video was requested by our patrons, so to those of you who badly wanted it, I hope it was worth it. We have a hobby-focused Patreon channel within our Discord where you can request specific tutorials like this, as well as seeking focused feedback from myself on your own painting technique. It's a great way to support the channel and also improve your own painting in the process. So if you'd like to check it out, follow the links down below. Of course, there's also plenty more to see or do in our public Discord, so hop in there too and get posting some minis. If you have found this useful, let me know down below or send me some of your own attempts with freehand. I always love seeing work from others, especially if they've been helped by anything I've shown off. We've got lots more hobby content coming soon here on the Red Path, so if you're not already subscribed, get on it. You won't want to miss what's coming up. For now though, let's close this one out. I've been Dara, this has been the Red Path, and until the next one folks, stay healthy, stay safe, and kill, maim, burn.